components of flood resilience. Excellent. And so, first of all, to set the context here, on this slide, I have a diagram that outlines in white the catchments of the Bow and the Elbow rivers. And, sometimes sitting in Calgary, it's very easy to forget that what we do have upstream of us are almost 9,000 square kilometers of steep, high mountain catchment. And that very steep roof, if you will, provides a very, what we refer to in the hydrology business as flashy response. If I were to liken the Bow and the Elbow catchments to an automobile, they would be far more the Ferrari than the smart car. This means there's very limited time to respond. Unlike many jurisdictions around the world, including places like Winnipeg, the flood response of our catchments is very rapid, and that means that emergency response activities really have to happen quickly, and we do really need to have measures in place ahead of an event because of the very changeable circumstances that we have. We do also have the case that because of the steep terrain, we don't have a lot of natural storage. We don't have a Lake Winnipeg, a Lake Ontario, a very large storage. Yes, we have some alpine structures, and there are 8 hydropower structures operated by TransAlta on the Bow and the Elbow River systems, on the Bow system, and the Glenmore Reservoir on the Elbow River system. However, they provide relatively modest storage relative to the generation capacity of this beautiful mountain catchment. We also have the situation where the alpine runoff, unlike the plains that tend to melt off March, April, in the alpine, because of the higher elevations and cooler temperatures, we have that delayed mountain snowmelt that is occurring at exactly the same time when the global circulation patterns are heating up that moisture in the Pacific and in the Gulf of Mexico and bring that moisture to continental North America. So exactly the time where we can see widespread heavy rains are the times where we also have the peak generally of the alpine melt coinciding. So flood risk really is a natural consequence of the upstream geography, topography, and meteorology that is part of the context of where the City of Calgary is situated. This is a really important slide, and this is a very interesting diagram. What we can see is that as Calgary was developing, as its population was growing, there were a number of significant hydrologic events, a couple of big floods, particularly back in 1879 and 1897, then again in 1902, 1912, and then up until about 1932, a fairly regular pattern of significant events. And then this really interesting period from about 1932 all the way up to 2005, where not a great deal happened either on the Elbow or the Bow. So this long multi-decadal period, which really seems to, after significant investigation, doesn't seem to be much more than just the hydrologic roll of the dice. There have been a few postulations as to why we saw this period while Calgary was growing, where there just simply weren't many floods. Some folks were thinking that that's because of hydropower storage that had been built upstream. Really not the case. There isn't adequate storage to buffer these large events significantly. Some folks were thinking about land cover and the fact that our national parks had forest fire control, which was changing vegetation and restricting runoff. That also doesn't seem to bear out under higher scrutiny and analysis. It really just does appear to be nothing more than the hydrologic roll of the dice. And when we look at adjacent basins, so when we look at the Red Deer system to the north, or we look at the Highwood system and the Oldman system to the south, there is a much more regular pattern of high flow events. So it does appear that, very importantly, from a sociological and a political perspective, while Calgary was really growing the most in terms of its population, in terms of its urban and municipal fabric, we didn't have a lot of flood events, and that led to the consideration by many, including politicians, that flood risk really wasn't a component of what was a risk element for the City of Calgary, for the Bow and the Elbow River basins. Certainly in 2005 and then again in 2013, this was very much dispelled. And again, this is a really important sociological artifact that I think comes into a lot of the discussion that we'll have as I move forward here talking about resilience. So really interesting pattern. I will also comment that 1879 and 1897, as you can imagine, we did not have the systematic ways of measuring flow in place that we do have today. And so these are two estimates that have been made based on anecdotal information, really taking water level observations that were recorded anecdotally at the time, and then using hydraulics to look at the river flow patterns to be able to understand what those values would have referred to. And it's clear that both of those events are significantly larger than what we did see in 2013. So though 2013 was a very significant event, it is certainly not the largest event on record. It's important to recognize that though there's been a long period without significant flooding, events equal to or even greater than 2013 are evident from the records that we do benefit from. That brings me to the 2013 flood. 2013 flood probably needs no introduction. It was at the time the largest natural disaster in Canadian history. It did generate more than $2 billion of losses locally in primary and secondary economic losses. So direct building content damage, as well as business disruption, transportation disruption. We did see our third fatality in Calgary since 2005. So unfortunately, 2 fatalities were sustained in 2005. Thankfully, only one in 2013, but I say only one, that is one too many. That fatality remains with me, sort of a deep scar. I was, on shift when that happened, and it's something that I carry with me, and it is a big part of the driver that's driven my passion toward ensuring that Calgary will see higher flood resilience as we move forward. So something I certainly bring my staff and my own presence of mind to daily as we're doing our work around flood resilience. It was the largest event we've seen since 1897 on the Bow River, and the largest event that we have even anecdotal information for on the Elbow River. It resulted in really significant impacts: major riverbank erosion and deposition of gravel bar materials, debris. River floods remain Calgary Emergency Management Agency, so CEMA's top hazard. And, of course, this event, after a long period without really significant flood events, absolutely affected the thinking and the mindset of our citizens, our city council, the province, our development industry, our insurance industry. We really changed our understanding of risk very rapidly and very severely.
Yeah, sure.
And from there,
I'm gonna wanted to take a picture of it and show Robbie.
Leo, could you mute, please?
Oh, sure, yeah. I'll take a picture and I'll send it to you. Keep listening.
yes, and certainly the slides will be available afterwards as well. So coming to, after that 2013 event, the City of Calgary responded and tried to respond in a very systematic and thoughtful way. So what we did do was convene an expert management panel on flood mitigation. It broke the subject matter of flood into 6 major themes. And then this panel, which involved experts locally and internationally that were providing input. So teams of architects, engineers, planners, right down to citizens, were informing us. That work all ended up culminating in 27 recommendations that really became the backbone of the guidance toward flood resilience for the City of Calgary. A couple key things that were highlighted in that work and in those recommendations was that we recognized, and certainly this is one of the reasons I showed the context of our catchments on the very first slide, is that the issue of flooding is much bigger than the City of Calgary. So we would need to very much coordinate with other orders of government, other stakeholders, hydropower operators like TransAlta, all the way through to our citizens. And resilience would be complex, not involving a single sort of silver bullet solution, but really a series or a suite, a menu of mitigation options working together. And from there, that led to the city and the province working in a coordinated manner to try and study and combine and then compare all of the options and combinations of structural and non-structural, local and regional flood mitigation measures that could combine to create that optimal mix of the lowest cost and the highest performance in terms of flood resilience. And really, there were 6 key areas or types of mitigation that were considered. One was the development of new storage reservoirs upstream of the City of Calgary. One was to look at operational efficiencies utilizing existing infrastructure, so things like TransAlta's hydropower facilities or the City of Calgary's Glenmore Reservoir. Another was to look at local community flood barriers and local improvements. These are improvements to things like drainage systems, putting valves on our stormwater system so it can't backflood, pumping systems, erosion protection systems. Of course, new property and lot level programs to be able to incent and help homeowners, property owners, business owners become more resilient on their individual private properties, as well as some updates to land use policy and development regulation for flood hazard zones. And finally, that last piece, our final, if you will, goalie back in the hanging back in the net, the emergency response and forecasting components. So all these components really had to be looked at together and looked at in combination to find that ideal suite of things that would create the menu that would create the right meal to give us that optimal flood resilience mix. Sorry, oops. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my screen flipping around. Just pause as I get back to the right slide, please. Okay, so in terms of assessing options of those 6 categories and combining them, we really entered kind of a cyclic or repeating cycle where we undertook detailed technical studies and economic analyses, and then engineering, design, and conceptual cost analyses, and then brought those back to our citizens, the city council and politicians, to provincial and other stakeholders, and then reviewed all of that and sort of re-entered the loop again. And really between about 2014 and 2017, all of this work was occurring. So in terms of technical studies, this was everything from new hydraulic modeling studies, new hydrologic studies to understand flood in the context of the modified probability distributions with 2013 in the record, looking at river erosion, looking at morphology, looking at all the aspects that would connect not only to river flood mitigation, but to everything that river flood mitigation connects to: water supply, water quality, habitat, morphology, in some aspects, even elements like recreation. And I will advise that climate change was definitely a consideration here. What we did recognize is that not only from looking at the historical record, but understanding the possibility for an increased intensity and frequency of damaging events, that was definitely a component included in how we would design. And of course, in terms of economics, we'll touch more on this, but developing a very solid way of estimating both the benefits and the costs of individual flood mitigation components, and those components in combination, was really important to us. I'll delve a little bit more into that on upcoming slides. Of course, engineering, design, and conceptual cost analyses were really important to be able to understand all of the measures, particularly the structural measures. But even in terms of some of the non-structural measures, doing analyses around the engineering was very important and critical too. And then, of course, our council, our citizens, and our own team actually demand that the work that is being done very much would fit into the context and fit with the sociology of our existing communities, fit with the economy, fit with the values of our citizens, fit with the values of our business community, and prioritize appropriately. So lots of work kind of in a cyclical manner, really occurring between about 2013, 2014, all the way up to 2017. And what was key to our work was really understanding the net impact of flood. So when we're talking about flood, we're talking about anything that is probabilistic in nature. It's really important to be able to understand the severity of an event, but also its frequency. So if you're going to have, in a century, and you're going to build infrastructure that is intended to have life cycles of around 100 years or greater, it's really important to understand in that 100 years, how many flood events might that infrastructure see. Not only how many events, but how many events of what scale and magnitude. And to be able to address that, really what we did was assemble detailed damage curves that would look at events all the way from the 1 in 2 or 50% annual exceedance probability all the way up to the 1 in 1,000 or 0.1 annual exceedance probability. Calculate those damages using an intricate GIS-based tool that would look at every property, every asset within the city of Calgary, and then assess the relative damage based on some damage curves for each type of infrastructure or building, and then aggregate that for individual events. And then by simply multiplying out or taking the integral between the probability of those events and the magnitude of their damage, we could compute an average annualized damage. So this became really important to understanding the net risk profile. And as you might expect, big events like the 2013 event, events that have a 70, 80, 100-year, even on some parts of the system, 2013 was as high a return period as 1 in 200-year. Those events are important, but of course they occur so infrequently that they actually don't drive a lot of the total or aggregate damage. So it's really events that are occurring somewhere between the 10-year frequency and about the 75-year frequency that tend to drive the bulk of the aggregated damage. So it's important to understand that. Of course, that varies by community, by infrastructure type, that varies by a lot of different factors. But this was a really important tool and a really important step. I can also indicate, and you see this on the graph, that what we understand is that in 2013, so prior to any of the mitigation and recovery work that we did following 2013, the total exposure we would have expected in the city of Calgary aggregated to almost $170 million per year. That is, if you did nothing to fight against floods. Oh, pardon me, my lights have gone out. I'm just going to pause for a second while I flip the light switch back on. It looks like our climate change folks have done a good job in ensuring that we're not wasting any energy because the lights won't come back on. I hope that's okay and you can still see me. I was just saying that, yes, that 2013 time period, our total exposure would have aggregated to about $168 million per year. And that was, again, largely due to events between about the 10-year return period and about the 75-year return period. Not suggesting that there weren't significant damages for higher events, just that the probability of those was so infrequent that they weren't a dominant part of the aggregate. So really significant exposure. And what that really did was give us an understanding of the net envelope that we could invest before we would even hit break even in terms of flood damages. And of course, this is before considering the effects of climate change. So with a tool like the triple bottom line calculator that we had developed, very definitely we could look at different scenarios, including scenarios where we might increase the probability of events or increase the frequency of severe events, or cases where we might apply in concept mitigation alternatives and look at how their performance would change these damage curves and that net exposure. And all of this work, including the significant public engagement that occurred, really turned into or informed what became a core flood resilience strategy that was developed and brought to our city council in 2017. In 2017, that mitigation measures assessment that was completed led to the adoption of what was a plan that really had a core of structural flood mitigation. On the Elbow River, that involved two particular investments in particular. There were many others made throughout the Elbow River catchment. However, the two backbone pieces of structural flood mitigation for the Elbow River were the Springbank Reservoir and increasing the capacity of the Glenmore Reservoir by adding new gates to the dam crest at Glenmore. On the Bow River, a little more complex, we were looking at an ideal combination involving new storage, that is a new reservoir upstream on the Bow River, along with refined upstream dam operations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up, as well as that wouldn't be enough to get us to 100 or 200-year level of resilience where we start to hit that break-even point between investment and mitigation and the offset costs of flood damage. We still needed on top of those elements community scale flood barriers in at least 4 communities, along with drainage system improvements and some other improvements. All of those measures on top of or layered in with all of those measures, we would continue to work on and see strong benefit from refined forecasting, monitoring, and communication of risk to citizens to allow for better preparation, longer lead times, and better response. Continued refinement of our own municipal emergency response and preparedness for flooding. Refined land use policy, so changing how we were regulating land use in flood hazard zones, the floodway and the flood fringe zones, as well as some lot level programs to, again, help citizens, businesses understand the risk in their area for their business, for their community, for their land uses, and help them adapt to that, as well as assessment of insurance and other financial mechanisms. But really do want to bring back to that core of structural flood mitigation, which might sound fairly old school engineering, but it really did involve new reservoirs on both the Bow and the Elbow rivers, as well as some local or regional improvements layered in with those. And I'm happy to report that all of that work has culminated now 10 years on in a very, very significant reduction. So on the left side of this slide, you're seeing a pie chart that identifies that of that total $168 million per year, as of last year, 54% of that, or the AAD, or average annual damage of $91 million per year, has already been eliminated by measures that have been put in place. $77 million of risk annual average damage potential remain. That's 46% of the original 168 million. 46% of that remains, but we do expect by 2024 to have that 77 million cut down to about 49 million, leaving only just under 30% of the original risk back in 2013. And I'll touch on the reasons for that coming up. So we have seen really significant reduction through the investments that have been made already. What's happened since 2013? I'm really happy to present this slide. Well, a number of things. Very importantly, at the top of the list here, regional infrastructure and operations. So very importantly, in 2016 and then renewed again in 2021 was an agreement that was struck between TransAlta, the hydropower operator on the Bow, and Alberta Environment. And that agreement sees modified operation of the Ghost and reservoirs on the Kananaskis, so upper and lower Kananaskis lakes, as well as Barrier Lake, to be able to affect better flood mitigation for all communities downstream, including Calgary. We've been working with the Bow, what's called the Bow River Working Group, looking also at incremental storage. There have been 2 phases of study that have narrowed what were originally 14 options for looking at new reservoir storage down to 3 options. And now further work, engineering work, is proceeding on those 3 options to hopefully narrow those to 1, prove out the performa of that one, and then proceed with that at a somewhat more protracted time scale than we've been able to achieve on the next element. On the Elbow River, we have been able to work with the province and are very pleased to support the province's continued work on the Springbank off-stream reservoir. And I'll have a little more detail on that coming up on an upcoming slide as well. In terms of municipal infrastructure, we have constructed flood barriers after a detailed analysis looking all throughout the city along the Bow, the Elbow, and Nose Creek, evaluating at a conceptual level, the engineering merits of barriers. We have decided to construct barriers in a number of communities. You see these, some of these pictured here. If anyone's been to Eau Claire recently, you may recognize there's a new longitudinal bench that runs along the pathway and promenade in West Eau Claire. Hidden inside that is actually a functional flood wall that is concrete, has been designed to withstand the forces of flood inundation, and it extends all the way up to the 200-year flood level to protect the downtown to that level. So that's one example. Certainly there are others throughout the city. Pictured on the slide also is a zoo flood barrier, which is predominantly a steel sheet pile structure placed about 4 kilometers of steel sheet pile around the zoo. That's been in place for a number of years now and is providing protection to that important cultural and historical asset as well. We've also made a number of improvements to our drainage infrastructure. So pumping stations, stormwater lift stations, stormwater valves to gate off the stormwater system, which can inadvertently allow for floodwaters from the river to progress into communities during high water events. We've also made a significant investment, about an $83 million investment in the Glenmore Dam, placing new operable gates on the crest of Glenmore, extending the capacity for flood attenuation by volume of roughly double the original 10 million cubic meters of storage that Glenmore would normally offer. We've also changed a number of things about our municipal operations around flood. And back in 2014, we made some amendments to the land use bylaw to ensure that the regulation of new development and building form in flood hazard areas was making or meeting that 1 in 100-year standard. So no new infrastructure is being built within the City of Calgary that does not meet the 100-year standard. So that's an excellent advancement and certainly helping to preclude the accrual of any incremental risk. We've refined our emergency response plans, and I'll have a little more on that, but we've also purchased more materials, got more staff trained, and got more activity each year to be able to plan for, forecast, and then respond to flood events should they occur. We've invested pretty significantly in forecasting and monitoring, and we've done this jointly with Alberta Environment's River Forecast Center. They've helped us develop a new software platform that is really night and day from what was available back prior to 2013. We've got a model now that allows us to take in 8 different global circulation models with weather forecasts up to 10 days in advance, feed in real-time information about soil moisture, snowpack in the mountains, be able to feed all of that directly to a hydrologic model and forecast river flows at the acuity of 3 to 5 days, in some cases as much as 10 days, giving us some better indication of what we might have to do to respond to an event should one occur. And certainly, last but not least, is we've really spent some time with our communities, helping new Calgarians, but also helping Calgarians who just may have been caught off guard by the risk that did transpire in 2013, to better understand what different sizes of flood event might look like in their community, and more importantly, what they could do to prepare, what they might be needing to think of between that important May 15th to July 15th period when we do see the highest risk of flood in our jurisdiction. And I do want to indicate that in 2013, there were really significant learnings. One of the things I recall, really being astounded by was the speed of the response, both on the Elbow and the Bow, but especially on the Elbow River. While things were happening in 2013, I was part of our flood response team. I recall being on shift, and we have some instrumentation in the Glenmore Reservoir. I could see real time the water level rising. And I recall phoning the operators at the water treatment plant, said, you guys got to send someone out there to read the manual stick, because I think the sensor's wrong. I don't think that nature can make the water level go up this fast. I just couldn't believe it. I thought the sensor had become unmoored or had been become damaged in some way, because it was rising at a rate that was about 3 times higher than anything my hydrology team had predicted with models in the past. So that was a really important learning, a relearning, I guess, of the speed and rapidity of response and the intensity of response that these steep mountain catchments can provide. Along with that, there were a number of other learnings just in terms of how we as a municipality could be more efficient in terms of our response, and certainly how we could communicate better to citizens to help them adapt more quickly and protect not only their life safety, but also their property under events. And you see here a smattering of photos that illustrate some of the effects that occurred during 2013. One question that often comes up when we talk about flood is, well, why not just buy everything out? We're going to have events over and over. With climate change, it's going to get worse and worse. And to that end, a great deal of analysis has been done. And it really becomes a question of what's the break point for moving? What are the factors in terms of relocating or having organized retreat from river valley areas? And really, the analysis that we've done demonstrates that the cost of even a relatively small or partial, community scale relocation is so significant that it absolutely dwarfs the mitigation costs to meet the same service level or better. And these are really, really impressive and staggering numbers, but they really have to do with the fact that, again, thinking back to that second slide that I showed that sort of demonstrate the linkage between Calgary's population growth and particularly that period between 1932 and 2005. So while the city was growing, there really wasn't an understanding of that risk. And so a lot of the uses that evolved really drove property values, the intensity of use, the types of use that were occurring in our river valley to reach a level where they were so much higher than the mitigation costs that it absolutely makes sense to protect in place much more so than to look at full-scale community retreat. Now, this doesn't mean that the City of Calgary wantonly or doesn't look at land uses very, very carefully. In fact, high-risk uses, we're looking at increasing standards to be able to limit the location of things like daycares, healthcare facilities, institutional uses that might have higher risk from zones of flood risk. But in general, this question often comes up, why not relocate everything? And the short answer is because it is far, far more efficient, far more beneficial from a triple bottom line standpoint to actually protect in place certainly in our jurisdiction's case. These are more numbers that kind of tie to this, and they utilize the terminology of floodway and flood fringe. These are the zones of hazard classification or flood hazard zones that are in use by the City of Calgary and endorsed by the province. Really, the floodway is that area that's directly adjacent to the river that is required to convey the design 1 in 100 year flood event for the definition of floodway. And the flood fringe is more or less area that can be filled and developed. That is, engineered fill can be placed and we can see development, and we do have that type of thing occurring in places like Quarry Park, many other communities throughout the City of Calgary. But they're okay to develop because they're not generally part of the conveyance capacity of the river. So provided that adequate building form and floodproofing controls and development controls are implemented, flood fringe is generally developable. But what we can see is there's a staggering amount of infrastructure located within these zones according to our current definitions of those zones. And really that is one of the key factors behind why a protect in place strategy and approach was one that is really behind the City of Calgary's flood resilience plan and program. Some other things to think about in terms of triple bottom line factors when we're thinking about that idea of organized retreat. That analysis of just the infrastructure that's present on the ground, it ignores the fact that there are incremental costs to develop and then service and or replace any community or residential housing that you might need for areas that you might abandon. So if you were to say, hey, Elbow Park or Bowness or Sunnyside ought not to be repopulated, well, those folks would have to be repopulated in some other part of the city where new servicing, new infrastructure, additional roadway, additional curb and gutter, additional pipelines, telecommunication lines would need to be situated. We'd also be increasing the environmental footprint of our city. And I'll bring you back to something that's fairly core that our planning group has been emphasizing over the last number of years. We're really trying to have Calgary adapt to the point where we're seeing more development in existing communities and generally higher density in existing communities rather than continue to see increasing footprint at the rates that we might have seen in the past. Of course, there's a mix of housing types that our market and our citizens want, but very much we're trying to encourage the City of Calgary to not grow as much as in terms of land area as much as it can in terms of population and economic capacity. So very importantly, that does mean in general, some of the areas where we do have the core city infrastructure, the center parts of the city that happen to be along the Elbow and the Bow Rivers are places where we're looking at increased density. And we do want to limit that environmental footprint by not having more and more land. Right now, the City of Calgary covers approximately 850 square kilometers. That's roughly equivalent to the catchment size of the Elbow River above Bragg Creek. So a really significant footprint, and limiting that is an important consideration in where we're going in terms of overall civic planning. And certainly we don't want to abandon the historical and cultural artifacts. I mean, many of the oldest parts of the city, Fort Calgary, the zoo, Bridgeland, downtown, Inglewood, these are parts really of our historic and our social fabric that in some ways are absolutely irreplaceable. So that's another important consideration in terms of the idea of sort of organized retreat. And we certainly don't want to orphan any of the investments that we do have in core infrastructure, and much of that arterial infrastructure does run through the core of where our flood risk zones are in the river valleys along the Bow and the Elbow. We've also noticed through the communication and engagement we've done with citizens that citizens are very attached to and do not want to give up their communities. Their home is their home, and there is something that is almost intangibly valuable to citizens about the connection they have to the place where they've spent their lives, reared their children, lived their lives. And certainly all of those factors came into the consideration, the triple bottom line analysis we were doing as we were looking at flood mitigation alternatives. All that being said, the work that we do within the Water Resources Department and the climate environment groups at the City of Calgary, we do try to approach everything around water resources from an integrated risk approach. And we really aim for integrated watershed management. So as we were building out the flood resilience plan, we were conscious that we did not want to put in place flood mitigation measures which would exacerbate or create problems in other areas of water resources management. We didn't want to negatively impact water quality or habitat. We didn't want to create infrastructure that would enhance or increase the potential for erosion, decreased opportunities for recreation. And so we took that approach and tried to focus on ensuring that programs like our riparian action plan and strategy and our bioengineering for bank stability programs were part of the resilience. What you see pictured in the lower right of this frame are a couple of examples of mitigation measures for bank erosion and riverbank stability that we put in place that use more bioengineering focused techniques as opposed to, if you will, hard gray engineering techniques, as we sometimes refer to them. These allow us to get better habitat performance, better aesthetics, and opportunities for things like recreation, pathways, river access, etc., and a more diverse group of plant species adjacent to the river that then provide cover and litter for fish habitat, as well as many other benefits. I mentioned this earlier as well, but in 2014, we did make some refinements to our land use bylaw, and those are really intended to encourage a real evolution in terms of the flood proofing approaches that could be applied for new infrastructure. So here you see an example of a house that's been constructed along the Elbow River, and it's been constructed very much in cognizance of the river levels that could occur, with all of the main living spaces above the 100-year with a significant buffer and with the ability to allow flow to pass without creating an impedance to that flow and the impacts to adjacent properties. So this is a good example of some of the innovation that we're now seeing in our design and engineering community. So with that, I've been talking for a little while. I'll give you a quick summary and then be very happy to take some questions. So yes, Calgary very obviously lies at the confluence of two steep, flashy mountain rivers. They've got alluvial floodplains. They are absolutely, part and parcel of what creates the flood risk in our community. Very interestingly, we had this long period between about 1932 and 2005 where we didn't have any significant flood events, and that had a really important impact on, if you will, lulling some in the community, including our politicians, into the state of not understanding that we had this very extant risk because of the topography and morphology of the stream system we have upstream. And certainly the use and value of lands, economic and social factors evolved over those decades without floods. One example I like to give is that back in the 1980s, when our current, some of the current regulations prior to our 2014 update around building regulation in flood zones was created, the use of basements wasn't anything like what the use of basements is today. Today, we find a lot of high valued infrastructure in basements. When I was growing up in our basement, I remember there only being a sack of potatoes. So some of the factors that we couldn't really foresee in the way we use land has really changed, and that has really changed some of the economic analysis that is relevant today relative to the question of flood resilience, and importantly, the investments that can be made to meet or offset flood damages that would occur otherwise. 2013 obviously was a really big event. It resulted in over $2 billion of direct and indirect damages combined, really significant impact to our community. And then after 2013, we did develop a holistic resilience plan, really based on expert management panel recommendations divided amongst 6 themes representing flood. Really core to all the work that we did was developing a triple bottom line analysis tool to assess risk. And then, as I described, aggregate that risk to understand average annual damages and really understand the total financial impact, compare that with the investment in mitigation. We also recognize that it would require a combination of local, regional, structural, and non-structural measures working together. We wouldn't find a single silver bullet, and that has been the case with our flood resilience plan. I'd also indicate that non-structural measures that we have pursued and have invested in include forecasting, emergency response improvements, public education, really importantly, land use regulation refinement, insurance and lot level programs we're still working on, but those are important components that are very important to deal with the residual of risk that is left after our structural mitigation is put in place. And finally, community scale land use redesignation and retreat were definitely assessed, but did not appear to be components that made the most sense in the case of Calgary's journey toward flood resilience. So with that, I'll indicate that Calgary continues to work and really has benefited from a very positive relationship with many stakeholders, but not least of which are the provincial and federal governments, who have helped co-fund and have gotten behind a number of the programs and projects that have been core to the reduction in risk that we've been able to affect over the last 9 years since 2013. So with that, I'll thank you very much for your attention and welcome any questions. If you don't mind, I'm going to try to turn my light on one more time just so I can see what I'm doing in my office here. If you just give me 1 second. It looks like I'm completely drowned out of power. So again, our climate change group's doing a very good job of limiting our carbon footprint here at the City of Calgary.
Well, that was great. Thanks, Frank. I see a question in the chat, but Leo Flaman had his hand up a little while back. So Leo, do you want to ask your question?
First, I wish to apologize for having my microphone on when and it interrupted your talk. So I apologize.
No problem at all, Leo.
Yeah.
Anyway, my second of many assignments here in Calgary was in 1971. And I worked for many years with Montreal Engineering. My assignment here was to work on the thermal power developments that Calgary Power were doing up at Lake Wadman. But at that time, Montreal Engineering did a floodplain study for the City of Calgary. And it would seem to me that the recommendations, well, the work that they did, the floodplain that they identified, and the recommendations that they made were just put on the shelf and left there. Can you comment?
Leo, I'm familiar with that work, and I'm actually glad you're here tonight. One significant change that did occur was in 1984, and this followed on the work that Montreal Engineering Manenko had completed. In 1984, a piece of work called the Calgary River Valleys Plan was developed and passed through council. What it led to was actually the city's acquisition of, with the gracious donations of a number of prominent Calgarians, it led to the acquisition of a significant amount of what is now parkland in our river valley areas, largely from about downtown, sort of going south and downstream on the Bow. But you're absolutely correct, Leo, that there was an understanding from the work that Montreal Engineering did of the natural risk, and many of the recommendations were not pursued. Very interestingly, some of the mitigation measures that were looked at back in the 70s and then in the early 80s, both for the Elbow and the Bow, have now become part of our resilience plan. So for instance, the Springbank Off-Stream Reservoir was a site that was identified through an earlier study and had, come to the fore after 2013 and is now under construction. The construction of additional storage on the Bow was very much something that was contemplated at a couple of different points, but not least of which after that Montreal engineering study. And I'm happy to say we're in the second phase of work with the province looking at the possibility. Though is a complex, expensive, and significant undertaking, the possibility of incremental storage on the Bow is something that is being actively explored by a consortium, a group of water license stakeholders and water management stakeholders, not least of which is the City of Calgary TransAlta irrigation districts. So Leo, it's fantastic that that work is in, and I will indicate that those old studies have been a guide to me as well. I'm grateful for them, and I'm grateful that I was able to find them in our corporate library and utilize them as we were moving forward. It's sometimes daunting that some of the ideas that were put together back then had not been acted on, and I take it on as part of my work to ensure that we do a little better this time, if you will.
Well, at that time, Montreal Engineering had worked for Calgary Power from the turn of the century in looking at the Bow. So they came to that study in 1970 with a lot of expertise.
Indeed, and it was quite evident. And like I said, it certainly stood the test of time. With some of my more junior staff, I make sure that we sort of pull out the old reports from now and again, and make sure that they do understand that basic understanding of the flood mechanism and the response. Even the basic hydrology and hydraulics was really, really quite good for the analysis that was done back at that time.
Thank you very much.
Yep, thanks, Frank. Questions in the chat from Alan Murray. Has a physical scale model of the Elbow and Bow rivers been constructed and calibrated? Question mark.
Yes. So a physical model of certain components of the Elbow River has been constructed. So as part of the Springbank Off-Stream Reservoir design, there's a full physical model of the primary hydraulic structures and portions of the river constructed in a laboratory in Ottawa. And it was done with the National Research Council, as well as a couple of professors of morphology working out of University of Ottawa, I believe. I wasn't able to go and see the physical scale model, but certainly the numeric models that accompanied and that physical scale model helped to calibrate. I was, able to look at. In terms of hydrologic models, what I was using back in 2013 was a pretty simple 3 or 4 subcatchment model of the Elbow Basin to predict floods on the Elbow Basin. What we've got now is a much more distributed model, and it takes real-time information. As I was mentioning, it takes meteorologic input from 8 different meteorologic models that are run around the world, a French one, a German one, an English one, a US, and 2 different Canadian models at different discretization, feeds all that information in sort of at the push of a button, and then we can see, if you will, an ensemble of outcomes. This has really helped our forecasting teams, both with the City of Calgary and Alberta Environment, much better understand the range of possibilities. And one of the important learnings from 2013 is that if you took the centroid of the rainfall that occurred back in 2013 and you shifted it only by about 50 or 75 kilometers, which is really meteorologically a hair width, you could end up with a completely different response. So the Elbow and the Highwood and the Sheep were really pounded hard. They had return periods in their upper catchments of around 1 in 200 year peak flow rate intensity. If you took that centroid of rainfall and shifted it, a little bit to the northwest into the Bow catchment, the response in the Bow would have been staggeringly more significant than it already was in 2013. So 2013 taught us a lot, and the hydrologic and hydraulic models that we do have access to now, they've really helped us understand the mechanism of risk much better, and then be able to populate things like that triple bottom line assessment tool to be able to understand the net damages for events ranging from the 2-year return period all the way up to the 1,000-year return period, much better. So that is an area that, aside from being one of the areas of passionate interest on my behalf, consider myself a bit of a modeler. We very much have invested in those types of tools to give us better acuity of what could happen, and then an understanding of how the mitigation measures that we might put in place will work and function under different loading scenarios.
That's good. Thanks, Frank. So the next question you've partially answered. And it says, have you had any opportunity to verify the newer enhanced modeling in the past few years? In other words, it's okay to make a model, but you need to validate it. So how have you been doing that?
Indeed. So when we do models, we do calibration and test runs and validation runs using historic events. And unfortunately, there are only so many of those. I would say that this year, June of 2022, was actually an instance where we're able to test out our models in a real time and in a real way. This year, we had an event back on June 12th, which looked like it could have intensities close to about the 2005 event, so not quite 2013. Well, as we were watching this event develop, every indication from the global circulation models we were looking at, with the exception of one, which was one of the European models, showed that we were to expect some really significant intense cells embedded in this larger rainfall event, and that temperatures, even at Alpine, would remain above the freezing point, so that we would see virtually all the precipitation of the event as liquid, not snow, as liquid rainfall. Thankfully, the one European model was correct, and about the last 50 millimeters of what ended up being about 150 millimeter or 6-inch rainfall on a significant swath of the Bow and Elbow catchments ended up coming as snow, and those higher convective cells that we were expecting embedded into the event didn't transpire. Our model sort of picked that up and allowed us this year to respond in accordance with that. So rather than having to evacuate the entire city, shut down the downtown, close off the LRT, we're able to keep things going. We did place a barrier across Memorial Drive and have to close down Memorial Drive for a couple of days, but the kind of response that we might have seen without those models would have been vastly more significant than what we did see based on the forecasting. And I'm pleased to say the modeling advancements were key to us not having kind of an underreaction or an overreaction to the event that we saw. And I am certainly grateful at a personal level that that last 50 millimeters did come as snow in the Alpine. We would have seen a much more severe response. Though we were much more prepared, having the gates on the crest of Glenmore, we would have been able to attenuate that to a virtually no damage type of scenario. It certainly allowed my staff and myself to sleep a little easier in those nights in June as we were anticipating the effects of that rainfall.
Super, thanks, Frank. That's really good. So the next question is, the incremental storage being studied is interesting. Can you elaborate? In Holland, over many years, they have dug many side arms to the rivers as emergency reservoirs. In the meantime, they become great biodiverse areas for birds at the same time.
It's a very interesting question, and I'll add that one of the groups that we worked with as we were building our expert management panel was actually a group out of Holland, a consulting group that the national government of the Netherlands supports as well. And they were key to some of our room for the river work, and they were key to some of our assessments. In terms of looking at that storage, because of the type of response we have, the rapidity and the speed, and then the fact that on the flip side, that means we have a catchment that is very steep. So when we have rain, we have too much runoff. When we don't have rain, we're quite prone to drought. And so storage is really, building a bucket that can store and then temporally sort of redistribute that water was a very important consideration. It's something that, as Leo had mentioned, has been looked at all the way back, even before the 1970s, 50s, all the way back to the early 1900s. And it's certainly something that's being looked at now. With the pressures of a changing climate, we see kind of a bimodal, kind of impact on our hydrology. We're seeing the potential for deeper, longer, more significant late summer droughts and earlier, more intense flood sequences during earlier alpine runoff. And so really the one way that is a kind of double benefit to address both, if operated intelligently with modern forecasting systems, is upstream storage. And so that is very much something that has been pursued, as I mentioned, starting all the way back in 2010. So even before the 2013 event, this Bow River Working Group had formed, and it involves, again, the major irrigation license holders. So the Eastern Irrigation District, Western Irrigation Districts, Bow River Irrigation District, the 5 major irrigation districts, TransAlta, the City of Calgary, other major water license holders, City of Medicine Hat, and then all the First Nations, all of the organizations and government ministries involved in environmental regulation have gotten together and really look at how can we use water better and more intelligently while sustaining the environmental functions of our rivers. Back then, we built what was at the time a fairly crude model that became part of the analysis that we did to really look at, is there anything we can do with either existing infrastructure or build new infrastructure to lead toward good water management outcomes in the long term? What all that work ended up doing was, after 2013, that original group that formed in 2010 got together again and said, we need to look at this some more. And we certainly did. Out of that work, 14 different options for new dam sites were derived by the group and then studied in more detail, eventually resulting in the shortlisting of 3. And now of those 3, we're looking at the further engineering design to assess the viability of one of those 3. So yeah, it's a really important aspect. And if folks aren't aware, the Bow River Basin is one that has a moratorium on new water licenses. So if a industrial or agricultural user or a municipality wishes to access more water from the Bow River or her tributaries, it is necessary to acquire in what is a water license market existing license. Alberta Environment does not create new licenses, and that is because the carrying capacity of the licenses that have already been offered meets the carrying capacity of the natural system itself. And so consideration on both ends of the hydrologic spectrum, both on the drought side and on the flood side, are very much a consideration in terms of the potential benefits behind incremental storage.
Thanks, Frank. That's full answer. I've got 2 more questions on chat here. So the next one says, could you please discuss if any dredging of downstream riverbeds was considered in your cost-benefit analysis?
Sorry, if any?
Dredging of downstream riverbeds?
Yes. So one of the important studies, and you might recall with that diagram I showed that was sort of a circular diagram, one of the important studies we did was something called the Calgary Rivers Morphology and Fish Habitat Study. This was done by a team of consultants, including Clone, Cripp, and Berger. We looked exactly at that question of understanding the sediment balance in the rivers and looking at whether or not either local or more extensive dredging would be effective. Other than at a few gravel bars, and there's actually one downstream right now, if you happen to drive along either Riverfront Ave or Memorial Drive, you'll notice by the Center Street Bridge, there's work ongoing there now, and there has been work on a number of other gravel bars and deposits that formed in 2013 to actually remove those, reshape them, create better fish passage, create better habitat, create better opportunities for recreation. So in a few locations, we've definitely done some river interventions to do what might be referred to as dredging. But dredging en masse really wasn't identified as a viable solution. It would have really significant impacts on fish habitat, really significant environmental implications. And then when you think about an alluvial river, it really is a system that likes to tend back toward equilibrium. So if you remove the sediment and the typical flow of water doesn't carry enough energy to keep that clean, sediment will redeposit. So the river will find its own natural shape, its own natural width and depth ratio. And that is really a function of the sediment that's incoming, the total amount of energy passing through the system, so the frequency of high flows versus low flows, and the geologic setting that the river's in, bedrock contacts, the amount of paving by more coarse aggregate as well. So yeah, dredging was looked at, but really in most cases, other than in local deposition type scenarios, of which there may be 10 or 15 throughout the city, most of which have been remedied, it wasn't a solution that carried forward for long reaches of river length.
Thanks. Last one on the chat here, Frank. Frank, are you and your team both dreading and looking forward to a real live event that puts all of the infrastructure to test?
You know what? I suppose we very much like having the Ferrari of some new infrastructure, but no, my team absolutely dreads events. We think very, very seriously about the consequences and the risks that occurred. And as I mentioned, the fatality and the health impacts, the human impacts are the things that I really carry as an engineer, as a human being, around with me every day. I can tell you that from May to July, I don't sleep that much. I'm at the office a lot. I'm there at night. Every potential event that might sneak over the Rockies, I've got myself and 3 or 4 other people peeking at it every hour on the hour. Yeah, we don't want to see more flood events, but we do know they're going to occur. And hope is not a plan. We are aiming to make sure that we have the infrastructure, the people, the resources, and then we're making the right land use choices so that we're not creating incremental risk where more lives or more economic assets are being put at any form of risk. So yeah, loved the excitement of 2013, but the impacts still resonate with many of those who were impacted. And yeah, during 2013, that was somewhat personal for me. My own home is in West Hillhurst. I recall giving the evacuation order for the area where I live, and my wife phoning me at 2 o'clock in the morning saying the police are here. I said, yes, go up the hill, take the children. I probably won't be home for about a month.
Good one. So last question, Leo, you had your hand up again.
Yes. Nigel, were you asking me?
Yeah, I thought you put your hand up again. I'll give
Yes,
you
yes.
give you the last question.
Frank, a number of years ago, I remember listening to someone giving a presentation from the government of Alberta, their environmental group. And one of the things I remember taking away was that the contribution to the flow of the Bow from glaciers was somewhere between 3 and 5%. Is my memory correct?
Yes, in general, that is correct. I would say that during periods of extreme drought, that proportion obviously increases, but net across the year, glacial depletion is not a significant total contributor. Predominantly, it's the accumulated snow in the alpine, as well as the rainfall we tend to see in 3 months, May, June, and July. So in Calgary, fully 50% of our annual precipitation, even though we think of ourselves as a northern city, snow, 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 fully 50% of the total precipitation amount in a year occurs in those 3 months, and very similar in the mountain catchments as well.
Thanks again. Thanks.
So Frank, we've gone a little bit over time. I apologize, but thank you so much for an excellent presentation. Really, really informative, and thank you for your such thorough answers to the questions. We really do appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. We will be sending you a certificate in the future for Operation Eyesight, because we've made a donation to Operation Eyesight in your name for giving this presentation. So I'd like to thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the City of Calgary, thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss our resilience plans with you tonight. And by all means, please feel free to reach out either through 311 or my own personal email, which is frank.frigo@calgary.ca, if you have related questions.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.